This work is focused on drug-drug interaction alerts and clinical decision support systems. So we'll start with a brief introduction to drug-drug interactions, or DDIs, which is the acronym we will use for the rest of the presentation. Drug-drug interactions, or DDIs, are responsible for close to 5 to 14% of adverse drug reactions in hospitalized patients. It's also a major risk factor for hospitalization, and particularly among elderly ambulatory patients. There are quite a number of challenges related to DDIs. The first is the high number of prescriptions, as well as the possible number of combinations of drug interactions. Of course, to overcome this problem, we do have computerized DDI, drug-drug interaction alerts. They do exist. However, they come with several limitations in terms of use during clinical practice and workflow. And one of the limitations is alerts with very low specificity tend to produce alert fatigue among clinicians. Additionally, there is this problem of overriding, which is the concept of interest to our study. Overriding is ignoring or not acting upon a computerized alert. So this is the term or the concept that we will refer to throughout this study. So why do prescribers override drug-drug interaction alerts, or any medication alerts for that matter? First is alert fatigue, because of the sheer number or the volume of alerts, there's fatigue among clinicians. It's also attributed to poor design and usability issues. Some of the recent studies demonstrate that this is more of a multifaceted issue. It's not just the design and usability issues. Some of the alerts are attributed to inaccurate warnings. So studies have shown there's little value for prescribers in terms of clinical relevance, or there's incorrect judgments from the prescribers. So there's a vast body of literature that have examined this issue of overriding medication warnings, including drug-drug interactions, the rate of overriding drug-drug interaction alerts, and the features that may increase override rates. So our study objective is to determine this prevalence of overriding drug-drug interaction alerts from clinical decision support systems. And we sought to do that using a systematic review of existing literature. More specifically, we have two objectives. The first is determining the frequency with which prescribers override drug-drug interaction alerts. And the second is also determining those drug pairs that are most often involved in the overrides. In terms of methodologies, as I mentioned earlier, the concept of interest is the frequency of prescription or medication overrides when potential drug-drug interaction alerts is triggered in an inpatient or an outpatient facility. Our manuscript describes the search strategy in detail if you're interested in our search strategy. We included all studies that reported override alerts, as well as override rates due to drug-drug interactions. And then we extracted a lot of the publication information, including the city and country of origin where the study was performed, whether it's inpatient or outpatient, the number of alerts, the percentage of alerts that were overridden or versus accepted, reason for overriding, and the top drug classes or pairs that were involved in overridden alerts. I'm going to give it to my colleague to go over some of the results from our study.
Thank you, Dr. Subian. Yes, so as Dr. Subian said, we conducted this scoping review using 4 databases. So those were Embase, PubMed, Web of Science, and Scopus. And initially we identified 236 studies. And then after we removed duplicates, and then we end up having 130 at that time. And at that specific point, and then we screen those articles. And then after considering our inclusion criteria, we end up having 34. And from those 34 studies, we extracted all the information related with override phenomenon. So next one. So Also, we included only studies that they were reporting in English. So that's why you can see that 22 studies were conducted in the United States, 7 studies were conducted in Asia, and 5 were conducted in Europe and the United Kingdom. And the facility type, it was a mix for some of them, but then most of the report were conducted in inpatient facilities where you can see that they're having this computerized system that they provide these alerts. Also, the override characteristics related with the within these studies, you can see that the override data collection timeframe ranges from 4 days to 46 months. And if you are interested more in the number of DDI alerts, which varies depending the size of and the type of healthcare facility, so you can see more details in table 1 in our manuscript. But here's an important portion. So the override rates is really high. So either in the US sites, but then also in non-US sites. So it's ranging from 55 to 98%. So which is like a really, really high override rate. And also 20 study out of 34, so identify pairs or single medications involved in the drug-drug interaction alert. So the common medications, as you just take a look at this, right? Most of the medications that they are involved in override, they are mostly medications that they use for cardiovascular disease. So as you can see, the first one are ACE inhibitors. The second one is anticoagulant. The third one, beta blocking agents. And then moving to the very end of this list of common medications involving drug-drug interaction, we have NSAIDs that you can use, for example, over the counter. But then also we have QTC prolonging agents. So it's really, really important that you take a look at this, look at this list and realize that one, mostly are for cardiovascular medications, but then second two, they're related with chronic patients. So they're using this medication in a chronic way. And then the top DDI overrides. So again, so here are some examples, right? Of DDI overrides, and the following are not meant to be served as just an example, as I said. So for example, ACE inhibitors and diuretics, or warfarin and ciprofloxacin, right? So some of these that you're gonna be using in a chronic way, but then some of these you're gonna be using for example, one agent in the case of warfarin, you're gonna use as a chronic agent, but then ciprofloxacin is going to be for acute illnesses, right? So next one. And then this was also really interesting for us to see that 18 out of 34 studies provided a reason why you are overriding, right? So, and then you can see that the reasons that they reported. So because the benefit outweighs the risk, for example, or we're going to put those patients in like a kind of monitor. We're going to take a close look at those patients. So we're going to just keep the prescription. But then also the alert fatigue, which is like one of the more frequent reasons. And then at the end, it's like, well, because you know what, the patient had already tolerate the combination. So it's really interesting, these reasons that they say. Okay, back to you, Dr. Subian.
Thank you, Dr. Villa, for sharing the results from our study. So as you saw, more than 50% on average of the DDI alerts are overridden. So few noteworthy observations from our study was first the definition of alert override. What does an override means beyond just ignoring them, and how the alerts are presented to the user. This was not very consistent across studies. So reporting the actual definition of alert override might be important. The second, as we saw, the range of data collection was from 4 months to 48 months. There was lots of variability, but half of the studies collected override data for less than a year, Perhaps future monitoring studies may have to collect data more than a year to see changes in the impact of alert overrides on patient outcomes. The third is different institutions may value certain combinations of drug-drug interactions as more important or relevant, depending on the population they serve or their institutional structure. So thus prioritizing only a specific group of DDI alerts over the others. And that made it challenging for us to make a list of top drug-drug interaction alerts that are overridden. And then fourth, in most US settings, the alert notifications are generated by just a very few drug knowledge database vendors. But the studies did not report the source of the DDI knowledge used in the alerting, which is a limitation. So keeping these four observations in mind is critical for designing future studies related to clinical decision support monitoring. A few key takeaways from our study, in addition to those four observations, led us to ask the question, is override rate the right metric for quality and safety? So in that context, the first takeaway is appropriateness of the override is an important consideration in study design. So in order to capture the user's intention to either accept or override an alert, we need some additional data, such as prescriber's intention, what's the source of the DDI knowledge, who's the vendor behind the drug knowledge, and some metadata related to the patients and prescribers that will help us understand whether the override was actually appropriate or not. The second key takeaway is collecting and reporting data on harm due to drug-drug interaction overrides is important, particularly because a study showed that 30% of all of the included studies were conducted in outpatient facilities. And these are settings where there's very limited follow-up on drug-drug interactions on patients. So perhaps a more actionable metric would be, in addition to the alert, whether the alert was overridden or not, the number of alerts that were associated to adverse event reports. That might be more useful, impactful, and actionable. However, there are a couple of challenges there. This requires more closer examination into the health records. And there's also consequences of attributing harm back to exposure to a particular drug-drug interaction. So a few recommendations for future studies related to monitoring and clinical decision support in the context of DDIs. One is there's a need to investigate the impact of tailoring alerts to site-specific workflows. If every institution is going to prioritize a set of DDIs that's important for their population and their site, we need to monitor them and see what is the impact on patients. Alerts considered to be of low clinical relevance, for example, may be eliminated, but it has to be closely followed up and monitored, because sometimes a variation in alert implementations or definitions may impact what is considered to be a very severe drug-drug interaction. Our second recommendation from our study is more research is also needed to assess the context of triggering alerts and their clinical impacts. Oftentimes, alerts lack context. And so to truly mitigate the issues with drug-drug interaction alerts, which includes alert fatigue and overriding, the clinical decision support tools need to be contextualized by taking into consideration the clinical factors, the user/the clinician factors, institutional factors, and certainly the drug and patient factors into consideration. We are also a larger team of interdisciplinary researchers working on a wide variety of problems related to drug-drug interaction and clinical decision support. You can find more information about our work at ddi-cds.org. If you have suggestions, ideas, or questions, please feel free to reach out to us at info@ddi-cds.org. Thank you.